Hi everyone, welcome to the Women of Distinction Roundtable 2024, hosted by ConcentricLife. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and congratulations to our honorees. And before we begin, I would love for all of you to just go around briefly, introduce yourselves, your full name and title, and maybe just a quick line about your background.
Absolutely, thank you. My name is Karen Todd. I'm a registered dietitian and a vice president of global brand marketing for Kiwahako USA. I've been in my industry specifically where we develop ingredients for the pharmaceutical and nutraceutical skincare industry that are more bioactives. So really doing some of the science behind the ingredients, and I've been doing this for over 30 years now.
Great.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Shivani Garg. I am a current employee at Pfizer, so I work in their advanced prostate cancer portfolio, working on a drug called Xtandi, recently launched in a new indication, so that's kind of been my passion over the last few months, bringing that to market. But my background is in public health and business, so I have degrees in both of those, but I've really been in the healthcare industry for the entirety of my career.
My name is Lauren Amadeo. I am part of the client solutions team at ConcentricLife. I've been doing this for about 25 years, working with clients of all sizes, but largely in the rare disease space to help bring their products to patients.
Great. My name is Arthi Bijlani. I am the Vice President of Marketing for the Sleep Business Unit at Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and we work in rare diseases across sleep disorders. And I do feel like I've been doing this for a long time, maybe 20 years in the industry, so it's been a while.
Hello, I'm Casey Dickerson. I'm the Executive Vice President, Head of Engagement at ConcentricLife. My job is to help take creative and make sure that it gets in front of the right audiences. I've been doing this for probably about 25 years now, and I'm delighted to be here with you all today.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Beechler. I'm Group Creative Director at ConcentricLife, where I oversee our creative teams doing all things health and wellness, which I've been doing for about 15 or 20 years. It's really a pleasure to be here with you guys today.
Hi, I'm Maya Arnold, and I head up our scientific strategy team at Spectrum Science. In this role, I kind of work to really make sure that not only are we understanding the science, but we're translating it into something that patients and everyone else can appreciate. And I come to this after doing this for about 10 years from a scientific background. So spent my life in the lab and then transitioned out of that to help educate people on the science and appreciate it.
Great, well thank you all so much for those introductions. I'm Lesha Bushak, Senior Reporter at MM+M, and I'm very excited to be moderating today. And before we dive in, I wanted to start out by highlighting some statistics and provide some context for our discussion. Some of you probably already know this, but I actually just learned this a few weeks ago and has really stuck with me. According to the Association of American Medical Colleges, we actually don't really know that much about women's health. That's because women were historically excluded from clinical trials. In fact, it wasn't until 1993 that the FDA reversed its guidance and officially mandated the inclusion of women in research. Even though it's been about 30 years since that, there's still a huge gap of knowledge when it comes to women's health and health disparities. For example, women account for 80% of all autoimmune disease cases, but we still don't really know why. And women still only account for 40% of participants in clinical trials for diseases that most affect them, despite representing 51% of the US population. And of course, that translates down to patient care and health outcomes. Studies have shown that across chronic pain, to chest pain, to ER visits, women's health concerns are more likely to be dismissed by HCPs than men's. So this 75-minute discussion will focus on the importance of female representation in health and how marketers can help boost representation from a variety of angles. We'll talk about some tangible ways that we can strengthen female representation in medical research, build cultural awareness in marketing, and bring up the next generation of female healthcare marketers. So to start on our first topic, female representation in healthcare, according to the Association of American Medical Colleges, there are 3 pillars that they've pinpointed to start moving the needle on boosting representation in medical research. The first is to attract and retain a diverse group of women in leadership roles for medical and clinical research. incorporate how biological sex differences affect medical care into medical education, and boost more robust and inclusive research and data collection. So my first question is, how can brand partners support these goals?
That was a lot in there.
I think we would all agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I think out of what you said, the piece that spoke to me most, though, was the second point about education. Because I feel like, at least in what we do from marketing communications, is exactly what we do. And it's a lot to it, because it's not only we have to get the data, but then how do we educate doctors at all stages, both from med school all the way up to clinical practice. But then also the piece that I'm most interested in is how do we educate patients on their own conditions and foster those conversations with their doctors. So I think there's a lot that we can do as a marketing community to really support in those sorts of ways.
I do agree with you on the women are usually the primary caregiver, not always, but as the primary caregiver, they're usually focused on everyone else's health but their own.
Right.
And if we help educate them, taking responsibility, taking control from the beginning. So education, I think, is really critical. It's a great point.
I'll piggyback on that and say that I also think it's important to teach them how to use their voices, right? Those statistics that you just read out, and thinking about, like, the women and not having a voice, or not, until 1993 even being represented. I think it's really important to teach women how to go to medical providers and have conversations where they can actually be heard and actually affect change. And so that they are not looked at as somebody whose voice is just sort of crying and not worthy.
Yeah.
I also think it's really important to have that tangibly driven. So I remember a time when I was in a category, and we did research when women went into the doctor's office and they were talking to the healthcare provider, and they recorded the conversation, and when they left the room, you asked the woman, like, what did you recall from the conversation? I mean, that you recall 10%. The doctor's talking quickly, they're moving through the content. And so as you think about how do you make that an even more productive dialogue within the healthcare provider's office, like, what tools can we give them to capture the information, to think about the questions to ask, and to record them and pause, and most importantly, to your point about having the healthcare provider be able to, like, sit and answer. The challenge is we just don't have a lot of time, right? So how do we be most efficient with our time when they're actually in the office together?
Well, and I think a big part of that is in helping women to advocate for themselves and, like, understand what's going on, is having a common language and helping them to go in feeling empowered and know the proper terms for what it is that they're asking questions about. But then also that means that the physician, one, needs to be able to translate what they're talking about and not just speak in jargon. But at the same time, if they're meeting kind of in the middle with the physician using a little bit less jargon, but the patient coming in with a little bit more of that understanding, hopefully they can have a more productive conversation.
common
Kind of like,
lexicon,
how do
right?
we
They're
get to that
both- yeah.
common lexicon in the middle?
And there'll be more trust then too between both, which is going to ultimately have better patient
Exactly.
outcomes.
One of the things we've talked about often when we look at, like, clinical trial diversity and patient diversity is that you are likely to go see a physician that looks like you, that relates to you. And so previously, prior to whenever women were incorporated, a lot of times if you looked at clinical trials, you just saw white men in those trials because physicians were white men. So if you're looking for diversity, you try and recruit diverse doctors. And so I think it goes back to that education piece and making sure that we educate female doctors to then be able to relate to their female patients as well.
I love that. I will also piggyback and say, as somebody where I sit, we're always looking at the data as we're putting together marketing materials. And we talk to our clients about who is your profile patient or who is this target audience. And a lot of times those are reduced to sort of a surface layer. And I think that we have to do a better job of really understanding who our audiences are, being able to represent them, having nuanced communications that speak to them in different ways, although obviously there's not always a budget for all of that. But I do think it's really important to, think about the primary caregivers, think about the voices, think about the type of issues that they have, and then help overcome those with our marketing materials.
Well, also often I feel like women are marketed to as just women.
Yes.
And how do you get underneath that to really, I mean, all women aren't the same.
We are not a monolith.
And so how do you think about attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, segmentation within those patients to really then build that trust that you were talking about, to be able to get them to relate to their physician? And that isn't the piece that I feel still is missing.
I'm glad you all brought up, this notion that there's often a disconnect between, women patients and their HCP providers when it comes to communication. How do you think that brands, like in tangible ways, can better advocate for patients in those conversations? I know there's several challenges. You mentioned the short time frame, for example. What are some tangible ways that brands can help advocate for their patients?
I'm not sure who said it, but I like the idea of providing suggested questions and making a list. And these might be some of the questions that you have for your healthcare provider, but pick the ones that are most important to you, that resonate with you, every time my family, my parents, we go to the doctor, it's like, what questions do we have? And we all have to sit down and think about it. And sometimes it's a blank stare. So having those, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah.
And likewise, having some kind of sound bites you can pull from if you feel like maybe you're not getting the information you need from your doctor, or maybe they're not taking your symptoms or what you're feeling seriously. That can sometimes feel kind of overwhelming and off-putting, but you're there, you're at this appointment, you want to get your questions answered. So having some things you can kind of reach for to get the information that you need.
And even asking at that appointment, doctor, if I can't reach you, who in your office can I speak to? Is there a nurse practitioner? Is there a PA? Is there an office manager? Because you go home inevitably after that encounter and you have questions and the doctor isn't always available. So how do we continue to provide that two-way continuous dialogue outside of the office once they've left?
Yeah. I remember very distinctly some years ago I had knee surgery and I had to go see my doctor after the surgery, and he wasn't answering the questions the way that I wanted to, and he was about to spin and walk out the door, and I kind of had to stop him and say, but wait, I have this little piece of paper right here, and he actually stopped. So I do think that if doctors heard us saying that there is this disconnect and the patients don't feel heard, and educating them on the statistics around that, hopefully it would be able to give them at least a more conditioned ear to have some of those conversations. We know that doctors are under a lot of pressure in terms of time. So we as marketers have to think about, like, what is the information we can provide? But I still would love to just raise their level of awareness of the dissatisfaction sometimes when women walk out of the office.
I think we also need to work with doctors and remember that not all doctors are at academic medical centers, and not all doctors are at the top line or have a lot of time. It's how do we talk with doctors and physicians and PAs and the people that are actually interacting with patients at healthcare centers and at those clinics where a lot of patients that really don't have that same level of empowerment and education might be going in. So how do we reach down a few levels? Because I feel like often in marketing, we're thinking about the top tier. We're thinking about those key opinion leaders and things like that, not necessarily thinking down to the community level.
I do a lot of peer-to-peer education, and we talk a lot about how we get that KOL expertise to some of those physicians that might not have access to the latest and greatest information. And I think that's something that's really important, is how we disseminate all of that information and make sure it reaches the broader audiences. So it's something very valid to kind of consider.
Yeah.
To that point, I think it's interesting, you see doctors in more places now. The doctor who's on TikTok, I did it like this, or I did it like that, or, other social media channels, or on YouTube, right? So I do love that idea of, putting stocking the fish where the people are fishing, essentially, kind of flipping it on its head, but really giving content to physicians where they are to really make some of this breakthrough communication.
And I think with TikTok, it's our role to provide accurate content, accurate, meaningful content.
Yes.
With the age of misinformation,
Yeah.
I kind of see our role as, yes, we're selling products, yes, we're pushing a specific brand, but really we're educating both patients and HCPs with truthful information.
Yeah, I've done a lot of DTC over the span of my career, and the first thing we also say are doctors are people too, right? So what you might be sharing on social media, on a television commercial, your doctors are consuming that information too, so it's another great way to educate them as well.
Yes. So a lot of talk about how AI will also come into play for some of this. Now I know that's a big topic, but I'm sure we could get a lot
topic.
But there's a lot of conversation about how that information translates to the patient and to the doctor. So aggregating a whole lot of opinions and being able to share it in kind of one quick message as well.
Yeah, I think these are all great points. It's obviously one thing to sort of help educate the patient to advocate for themselves in these situations, but it's also equally important that HCPs have that increased awareness about some of these concerns. I'm curious if all of you have felt that you've witnessed any progress on this front, like in terms of HCPs gaining more awareness about some of these issues, like the fact that 29% of women have reported that their doctor tends to dismiss their concerns. Have you witnessed any progress that encourages you?
I think there's definitely progress overall, maybe not so specifically directed at HCPs, but we're talking about a lot more women's issues. It's much more common to hear things on social media or in podcasts or in just traditional media, like we're talking about periods, we're talking about miscarriages, we're talking about menopause. Those are kind of all having their sort of cultural moment. So I think that's positive progress in the right direction, but there's still a big unmet need and a long way to go in actually, delivering care for those issues.
Yeah. I mean, I know I grew up maybe in an immigrant household, but we never, like my mom never talked to me about sex. My mother came to visit us, and I have a 14-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old daughter who told their grandma all about what they learned at sex, and while she fell off her chair, what at least it told me is that we're able to have this conversation in a very sort of clinical and real way with, from a very young age, which, I do think is progress.
My kids are getting close to middle school, so you'll have to
We'll talk later. We'll talk later.
I think the other thing is for women like us to be advocates, right? I would argue that any of us will go into our healthcare provider and we will, put our finger on the table and demand the attention because we are so involved in it every day. We recognize the value of using our voices. We know we can make that doctor turn around, but I don't think that's the norm. I think it's because of the business that we are in. And so personally, I try and advocate with my friends, my mother, my family, anybody I know to really say to them, no, you have to stick an anchor in the ground and you have to demand the conversation. And so I think that there's something to be said for teaching women to do that, because once they learn how to do it, we handle it pretty well.
Yeah. I do think when we look at clinical trials as well, and we look at the data, we are starting to see like a shift in the right direction. I'm not going to remember what year it was, but the FDA did come out with more recent guidance. It was kind of there, you do need to be coming out with your diversity and inclusion, kind of what are the statistics and how are you enrolling your trial, and not necessarily a requirement for federally funded trials, but something that they now have to report. And with that, they're reporting more on the demographics that are in the clinical trial. And you can see more of the split in a trial of how many were women, how many were men, and things like that. And I think it's also some drugs and some companies are starting to look specifically at drugs in women and how does it actually work in a woman's body. We know our physiology is slightly different from everybody else. So I feel like it's moving in the right direction. I don't think there's a ton of studies that are looking at women specifically, but at least women are no longer considered just to be little men. So it's nice to see that at least it's trending in the right direction, it feels like.
I also think there's some brands that have differentiated themselves by creating things that are women targeted. So for example, like the Fitbit back in the day was kind of blanket for everyone the same, but the Oura Ring is pretty popular now, and I think they've adapted themselves to now do cycle tracking, to do fertility as well. And so you see men wearing it, but you also see this big uptake in women purchasing it because it has something differentiated for your women clientele. And I think we'll probably see a lot more of that with some of our brands because there are so many women that are into health and fitness. And so I think the more you can cater to that, the more that a lot of brands will be able to differentiate themselves.
And I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about cultural awareness and marketing communications. Casey very rightly pointed out that women are not a monolith. Sometimes they tend to be lumped together in one big group when it comes to brand messages or campaigns. But I'm curious your thoughts on how marketers can learn to really craft a more granular approach to how they approach women not as a monolith. Are there any best practices for them that you can offer?
Yeah, I'm looking at you, Casey.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, to me, it does go back to the data, which is to understand your audiences. And I think if I was looking at, a population of women, for example, to try and figure out the nuances within the population, right? So, I mean, you can slice data a million ways, we all know that, but really to try and understand, like, what is the mindset? And maybe think about how you structure targeted content towards that mindset. And it might just be the same content and providing it in a different order in terms of what does somebody value. So what's going to hook them? and get them engaged with the content versus just saying, we're going to tell everybody the same story every time. But I feel like that is what we have to do. I think we also need to think about having diverse representation in our creative and having people that look like us or them or you or me. And I think people are more likely to engage with content in that way. And then finally, just because I am the engagement person, it's also about channel, right? You know, some people will spend a lot of time on podcasts. Other people will be on connected TV. Some really prefer to read books and magazines. So we just need to make sure that we're putting our tactics in the places where these people resonate and get and consider it to be their trusted source so that we can make a better impact in getting to them.
I completely agree. I think it really comes down to understanding your population that you're trying to get at, and what is it that makes them tick, and what is it that's going to make them take an action, whether it's to change something or to not change something. And sometimes that just comes down to doing your research and like really digging in and doing research, you know, at the bench and kind of digging into what's out there, but also talking to people and being like, what actually concerns you and what are you really thinking about? Because yes, it's not the same as a whole, but sometimes you can whittle it down to pockets for different age groups or different demographics and things like that.
Can also take advantage of all of the data, like you mentioned, that we have in not just clinical trial data, but patient-reported data and things like the Oura Ring and Fitbits. People have all this data right now, so that's a big opportunity for us as marketers as well.
And I was going to say, ultimately, activating that data, really getting to an omni-channel vision world, you know, and I think there's a lot of multi-channels, there's little dribs and drabs of omni-channel. I don't think anybody has mastered it from where I sit perfectly. But using automation to cater content to individuals, and that goes back to the AI conversation as well. So not just getting to them in the right channel, but you know, figuring out the nuances of who their personality is or what information they're going to have, so that we can really have targeted, specific conversations based on where somebody is in their journey at that moment and what they care for. So I continue to work towards and look forward to that future.
It's going to be a fun partnership with the regulatory as we emerge on this brand new frontier. I would like to say I also look forward to that. I don't know if I do.
And obviously a big part of that, as you mentioned, is, you know, ensuring that the marketing teams and the creative teams are diverse themselves. How has having more diverses in the room made a difference in your experiences, and do you have any sort of positive examples that you know, you'd like to share? Obviously research has shown that more diversity is linked to more innovation. So I'd love to hear if you have any sort of experiences with that.
I mean, I would echo what you said earlier about sort of the diversity on the team. I think the more perspectives you can bring to the table, I think, you know, Lauren and I see it all the time in the teams that we work with. It's not just bringing marketers into a marketing team, it's bringing former sales, you know, bringing medical folks that have a commercial mindset. And so that way all, you know, sort of perspectives are represented. And I think just in general in everything we do, it's very cross-functional, more so than in any other industry that I've seen, in that everyone's perspective is valued, whether it's coming from the patient's angle, the insurance company's angle, from physicians, from NPs, PAs. And so the more we can create those really diverse teams, I think the more we can actually get underneath what the patients actually need.
And one of the interesting things about what we do is there's not necessarily a right solution to the things that we're trying to solve. It's very complex. So having these diverse points of views and perspectives really allows us to pressure test and kind of put what's out there in the best way possible, but also continue to iterate. And that's where it's really important to have these diverse teams.
Yeah. One of the things that we do, we have a phenomenal diversity member of our team who will, you know, if we're looking at creative, for example, she'll look at it, but she'll also pull in different members and have cross-cultural consultation. Could this be offensive? Could this be, is this appropriate? Is this like in situ for who this group of people that we're talking to? And so sometimes we have to change the creative direction, or sometimes we have to change out the talent, or sometimes she wants to change out, you know, what sport that they're doing. That group of people doesn't play Frisbee, they play basketball. And so I think that that's also really important to hear those broad perspectives and to understand, you know, how each detail is represented to be authentic.
Which echoes the whole importance, I think you were talking about, Maya, earlier, is the research, right?
Yeah.
So yes, internally vet it, but then take it to physicians, take it to patients, take it to payers to really vet and see how it lands on them.
I mean, I don't think the importance of market research can be understated. I mean, just actually going and testing things in the wild. I mean, it may test great in a population of 5 to 10 people in the office, but you actually put it out there and you're like, oh my God, I just offended like 600 people. So
Better to know in advance.
Yeah.
We did a big translation of a website from English to Spanish with a great vendor who, translated it perfectly, and then we put it in front of a group of Spanish-speaking colleagues, and they redlined that like crazy. They said, we gotta change this. It doesn't sound right. Nobody will resonate with
that.
this. And thank goodness that we had that resource within our company to be able to do that, because otherwise we would have put something out there without having that input that would just not have resonated for us.
So I love that, because we talk about the difference between translation and transcreation, right? Because it's not apples for apples. You can't just state something the way that you would in English in every other language, right? There are nuances or colloquialisms that are specific to languages, and so as we're building multilingual content, we must stop and consider those things.
So these are all really great points that you're all bringing up, and I'm curious again if you've all seen progress on these fronts, whether in terms of more diversity and inclusion on creative teams, on marketing teams, or in how they approach reaching people in their campaigns. Let's just say maybe the last 4 years, since 2020, when the pandemic was at its full swing, and there was sort of this national conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. Obviously, a lot of pharma companies and healthcare marketing companies pledged to, focus on DE&I more. So I'm curious if you've seen progress since that time.
Yeah, I don't have a statistic or anything, but I will say that from 2020 and onward, I've always had a woman leader on my team, which I think has made a huge impact on kind of the way other women in our business then progress. We have role models to look to say, you can do both. You can have a family and you can be a woman leader, which I didn't see previously. I think that in my prior jobs, granted they weren't all marketing, but in prior roles, when I worked for men leaders, a lot of the time the women that were looking up to our leaders would say, well, maybe you can't have it all. And so I think having women leaders now coming in and having so many of them is a really nice example. And I'm just only seeing it continue to grow.
Currently where I'm at, our CEO made a pledge and a goal to have 50% of the board and 50% of the executive team to be diverse, be it women, cultural, race, and we've met that and exceeded that goal. And I think that's great from a sort of very senior leadership perspective, but I agree it's really great to be able to have sort of female women leaders that sort of within your ethosphere, and it's nice to also expand that to outside of, as a mentor, to be a mentor to many of these other young women. So I definitely feel like in the last, 5 to 10 years, we've made tremendous progress.
And I've seen so much more focus on women, and women are stepping up and talking more about their health needs and asking for products, asking for what should I do with this, what should I use, and especially on social media, they're forming groups. And those can be great ways to track and see how what people are thinking and what their needs are from a market research standpoint. But it's research on women. I've seen more of it happen, but by women. I think that's really, really important. That it's as diverse as who's doing it, and it can really bring in all the innovation from all sides.
It's definitely heartening to hear that at least you've had some anecdotal experiences of progress. And of course, I want to make sure that we touch on AI. Obviously, the next couple years is probably going to be one of those buzzwords that we keep hearing. Everyone is incorporating it into their workflows. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how your teams are looking at the AI revolution when it comes to women's health, and what are some of the considerations and guardrails that might be needed here?
Well, so we're definitely looking at it, and we are thinking about, ways that we can use AI to, like I said earlier, dynamically generate content, be more efficient in that arena. I think I also am very aware of some of the watch-outs, right? Because AI is generated based on a database of either images or written words, and we have to make sure what's going into the AI engine is diverse enough to represent a diverse population in terms of what comes out. And so I think we do some thinking there in terms of, yes, you can use AI to bolster and support these initiatives, but there still has to be a level of human check. There still has to be a level of recognizing that AI is being pulled from somewhere, and that somewhere may be biased. And so I think we all just have to do a job of trying to figure out how it can accelerate our workflow, but at the same time, understanding that the human touch is critical.
I mean, we've been using AI for content generation, and just for that kind of that thought starter of, okay, how are we going to try and translate some very complicated scientific idea into something that's a little bit more simple and straightforward, and it's great for coming up with those metaphors and kind of trying to come up with that common lexicon that can be used. But I've definitely run into the instance where it's making stuff up. You go back and fact check it, and it's like, well, that's not a real reference, and that whole thing, this isn't right. So that terrifying. Human check, I mean, it's terrifying because people are going to AI and saying, trying to translate and figure out, well, I heard this term, what does this mean? Or, generate that content. But it does, to your point, that human check is so incredibly important as we're kind of starting to figure out how we're going to mold this forward. But at the same time, it's an amazing tool that's only continuing to get better as time progresses.
Well, and I think the way you just said it's an amazing tool, that's really how we're trying to use it on our team as well, and to use AI to streamline or build efficiencies around certain tasks, which then lets people do that deep focus work. So freeing them up to do that versus, having it create all the creative without that kind of human nuance in there.
I was just say a slightly different use of it also is we were talking a lot about regulatory work, and I think a lot of times we think about how do we then fact check AI, but another way you can use it is to look at content and kind of redline things that need to go. So I've heard of companies saying we're just kind of auto-loading words that you're not allowed to say, and so if a video is created, the AI can kind of check it and say, oh, these are the words that were said, we need to cut those, and then it goes to regulatory. So kind of expediting that process and making that a little bit more efficient, because we all know that can take a long time.
I love that. That's creative. I love that. We've also used it, but remember AI is dated as well, and it's, like you said, it's not always accurate, but it's dated. And what is it going to be updated with and when? I don't think we know that right now, but we use it to target different audiences from different language barriers, from talking to a scientist, here's how you would say this script, and talking to a parent, or talking to an 8th grader, a 5th grader, even a 3rd grader, and see how it relates, and then putting those terms in there that may or may not, from a legal regulatory standpoint, need to exist, and removing those. But it's fascinating to compare it. I love doing that.
Well, you think about too, just within our industry, there's so much data, and so just AI is just going to help us be more efficient, right? It can't be the human, but it can really help sort of streamline and create efficiencies within the process. One way I've seen it used in our industry is there's transcripts of patient recordings, patient calls, and AI is running through it to see if they can catch words that might trigger a future discontinuation, right? Or trigger, oh, I've seen an adverse event here, how do we then get that reported? So there's ways to use it in just multiple functions.
What I love about this is that we're actually talking about AI in healthcare so early.
Who knew?
I feel like healthcare is something, healthcare is usually slow to adopt. Like when EHR and EMR came out, it was this crazy concept. And the fact that we're thinking about AI as the rest of the world is thinking about it is pretty exciting for healthcare, I think.
And companies are using it. I mean, it's a really fascinating time to be doing the jobs that we're doing. Because companies are using it in dribs and drabs and pulling it in, and either regulatory or content or creative, or, even sometimes I think we'll, just the start of a concept starts in AI, and then somebody goes out and actually does the work itself. But it's just, and I think about like, the new job is the prompter, right? How are you going to prompt the AI? What are you going to ask it to do? But it is a really exciting time, I think, for us to be working in this arena.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how AI can be used to address some of these topics we've been talking about today. Boosting female representation in healthcare. Potentially helping craft more diverse campaigns, if at all. How can AI be used positively in these ways? What are some of the benefits in your views?
So I'm happy to go first. In my role in engagement, one of the first things that we always start by doing is putting together a patient persona or segmentation data or journey information. And if we can have more diverse data and use AI to, pull from a series of different sort of varieties of sources and just be able to have a broader representation of who our audiences are, I think we can do a better job of communicating with them and marketing them.
I loved your example of using AI to really tailor a conversation to a very specific target. That's really interesting as we think about dynamic target and specification of message. So it's not just a caregiver message and a patient message, but it's really by age, and I think there's a lot of potential there.
This would definitely require a human check, but one of the things we were talking about is a patient goes into a doctor's office, doesn't get answers to all of their questions, so where do you get that answer? If we are able to really fact check whatever the AI generator we're using, it can kind of provide, what if I ask an AI bot, I have this question about my health, and they have a repository of information that they can share back to me. Definitely a lot of checks there.
And I would love to know how to turn it off on my browser, because it's popping up on every browser I use.
Yeah,
I'm
driving
like,
you crazy?
I really don't want that.
Me too. Yeah.
But I think it's really important as marketers to go into AI and to ask them those questions, because that's what our patients, that's what they're seeing, and there
Seeing
could
the
be
same way.
misinformation, right? And to understand their mindset and what they're seeing, so that we can think about what's the best way to educate them based on what they're seeing.
It's the new WebMD.
It really is.
I was going to say, have any of you ever used AI in your own work where you're like, those moments where you're kind of stalled, your brain feels like it's not working, and you're like, what's a way I can say this? And then AI will, and just yesterday I think they integrated it into different Apple platforms, and so sometimes I'll even do that where I'm like, I'm prompting myself almost. What's another way to position this? And I'll be like, and it zips right up.
Brainstorming tool.
It really is.
Well, and it's great for just coming up with, okay, what's a metaphor for this?
Yes.
Help me just get started, and then I'll take it from there.
Shift F7 thesaurus is not needed anymore now.
I also think about putting things in layman terms. So if I'm trying to explain something really scientific to a patient, maybe that's a good use of it, is here is this really scientific line from our PI or something like that. Right. How does this translate to somebody who won't understand all this language?
And maybe in the future it's something that we can say, okay, well, I want to speak to this specific population, so how would I translate it there? So rather than even just translating for patient or caregiver, maybe it can help with some of that demographic and like race-based. Like, how do you have those different conversations?
For clinical trial recruitment.
Yeah.
If someone's like asking about enough symptoms, can it start to connect the dots between, you've asked about these 5 things or these
Can
5
I like
treatments,
direct you here?
Would you be interested in?
Right.
And also diagnosis. When you think about, people go to Google, they put in search terms, right? Imagine the ability to pull multiple, search terms and triumvirate on rare diseases, or, maybe here's a doctor you should speak to, or have you considered a neurologist, right? I think there's opportunities there to help with increasing the speed of diagnosis.
I think you mentioned it, the prompts are really important, and what you put in is can change tremendously what's coming out, and educating folks on the right prompts, the right time.
Love the idea of speeding diagnosis, especially for rare diseases.
I do too. I mean, they could be as long as 10 years to get diagnosed, 15 years to get diagnosed.
Dr. AI.
Right, but if somebody aggregates all of your search terms, and it's like, I've noticed over the past 3 months you've had a headache, and you've got a cough, and you're whatever, sneezing, or have you considered? I think it could be a really interesting way to help accelerate healthcare.
I mean, it is a bit of wild, wild west, though,
Yes.
I feel like. And so it's like, especially in our industry, trying to think about what are the guardrails, what are the metrics, what are the parameters in place to have it also be, ethical is not the word I'm looking for, but just being able to deliver accurate information, right? Responsible, to the patients, right? Because it could really go like a lot of different directions based on the search terms.
responsibility if it's wrong.
Exactly.
Yes. I wasn't suggesting that it was ultimate diagnosis. I was just saying it may roll the conversation forward. I do that enough myself.
Your quota of those questions have been reached.
Yeah.
So
The number of times
it a
my family
different
tells
way.
me I'm not a doctor, I'm reminded.
So you just play when it works.
Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of leads into, the idea that I've heard talked about a lot, which is that AI is not going to replace humans. There's always going to be that human element that's needed, and as the world begins to embrace AI more and more, how would you say that we can add that human layer to the work that's generated by the technology, like in marketing scenarios?
Well, I think what you guys were kind of talking about of being able to use AI to tailor messages is talking to people on a more human level because it's where they're at in their journey, or it's what they're looking for. So we're able to leverage the technology to provide better, more relevant information to people.
And I think what you said earlier, it's a tool, right? We use it to supplement what we already know, what we're already able to do, but to make things more efficient. The more efficient we can be, the better, but as long as we're then going back and doing that fact checking, I think that's the most important thing.
It's clear we're learning as we go, so we just have the right checks and balances in place as we learn.
Yeah.
Yep.
And sort of on that front as well, as you mentioned, there's still some guardrails that we need to make sure that we're putting in place. There's some sticky issues around AI, like hallucinations, misinformation. I have a statistic here that a recent Brown University study found that 2 leading text-to-image AI generators depicted surgeons as white males 98% of the time. So there's still that gap there as well. How would you say, where are you hoping to see some of these guardrails or, best practices put in place around some of these sticky areas around AI?
It's got to be that human check, right? Everything you do, whether it's for creative or clinical trials or for messaging, there's always has to be a proper check from a human with a reference on top of it.
I think it's also increasing the volume of what AI is pulling from. If AI is generating 98% white males as surgeons, then that means that potentially 98% of the images that it's seeing are white men. So how do we change that? How do we change that as marketers in the creative that we're putting out there? Maybe we're, showing a diverse woman as a surgeon, and just kind of increasing the pool of information that AI has to pull from. So then when it spits something back out, it's hopefully more diverse in the long run.
There is, luckily there is opportunity to feed into AI exactly what you want as an output. So as long as we have, I think, diverse mindsets and are cognizant of what AI is providing to us, we can then take it and say, no, this is not what we want to work with, and then talk back to it and say, okay, give me a room of diverse physicians, and then use that output instead.
Absolutely. And looking towards the future, obviously, as we talk about boosting female representation in healthcare, a big part of that is going to be, bringing up the next generation of female healthcare marketers. Gen Z, for example, is disrupting a lot of traditional views about healthcare. They prioritize self-care. They're more open to using digital tools and talking about mental health. Right now, Gen Z represents a smaller portion of health spending, but we know that they will be one day the target. How can we tap into this new generation in the workplace to influence how marketers think about reaching the modern consumer?
Well, we talked a lot even before we started this conversation on how COVID has changed work dynamics. And I really, as a working mom, really appreciate the hybrid environment that we're in. But I will say I do miss the in-person. And what I miss about that on a more regular basis is how we can coach Gen Z. And I think they don't necessarily want to be in the office. I'm really surprised. I think some of the older folks on my team are happier to come in than the younger folks. And they feel comfortable staying at home and don't really feel like they need to be in the office, but I think they don't know what they don't know. And there's so much coaching and mentoring and learning that happens in a room full of people, around a conference table, in a hallway conversation. So, I think while hybrid is great and we're all sort of being really efficient and effective working from home, how do we continue to help find opportunities for Gen Z to have ways to learn within the office, within their teams, colleagues, mentors?
I think I'll also add that I think that Gen Z really values authenticity. And so I think as female leaders, we need to be authentic with them about our experiences, giving them real feedback in a timely way, but also just being transparent in how it is that we're communicating about some of these topics, and being open to discussion. Probably, if I were to age myself back 15, 20 years ago, these topics weren't something that you talked about regularly. Your question earlier was, what have you seen in the last 4 to 5 years since the pandemic? So we're having these conversations, and I think it's important to bring them along for the ride, to have them be part of the conversations, to be authentic with our experiences or how we communicate or manage people, to teach about emotional intelligence, right? To provide them with psychological safety in their work to be able to do those things.
I think Gen Z is definitely important to consider, but I want to think about the next generation. I also don't just think Gen Z. I think about, I was at a dinner with a bunch of residents recently, and they are our next gen of doctors. So currently, when you think about marketing to a physician, you think about an RTE, or you think about something physical that you might hand to them. A lot of our future doctors get all of their information on podcasts. That's been so big recently. That's perhaps not Gen Z, but it is, I think, a really important next gen of doctors, because in 10 years, the doctors that most patients are going to be seeing are going to be the ones that are residents right now. So how do we educate that generation as well, while also considering how that's going to change for Gen Z, I think.
I think that's about meeting people where they're at. To your point, these residents are learning from podcasts. We know Gen Z goes to social media for information. So how do we lean into that and create that authentic, relatable content for them? Because we know that's where they're at.
That's exactly what I was going to say, and providing those multiple channels for education and information, whatever it is. And I heard it the other day, someone was saying if we could fact check TikTok as it happens, and like put
That
up
would be
the-
awesome if we could do that.
That's what we need.
Hashtag fake news.
That's why it's important to actually lean in as companies and marketers into those spaces, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. So that's why reputable sources need to be there talking to these people.
Yeah, instead we pull back instead of leaning into it.
Ignoring them just spreads the misinformation.
It really does, yeah.
I think it's important that, we don't just let the voices be there that are the voices of sometimes misinformation or unauthentic information. I think it's our job as marketers to, consider how we can step into the conversation and try and bring positives and truth to it as well.
Well, people buy from authentic selves, and everyone has kind of said that, but we are brands, and I think that's why the social media is so important, because people buy from people, not necessarily companies or brands. And having that authentic self is really, really important, and who that might be. So as we lift up and as we educate and as we replace misinformation, that becomes more and more important.
Absolutely.
Much easier to do in a consumer role than in healthcare, but I think about if I ever see something that says not sponsored, this is my true opinion about this product. Much harder to do if you're looking at a pharmaceutical, but I think that's what we really need, right? Is someone to go and say, I am not being paid, this is awesome, I love this product.
The thing is, those conversations are happening, though. If
Yes.
you look in social chat rooms, like people are authentically going to the internet and looking for somebody who has a like experience. What product were you on? Or why am I feeling this way? Or did you take HRT? Or, I participate in some groups and I'm more of a stalker just because of, the job that we do. But women are talking every day about so many different topics, and they're looking to anonymous people, along with their friends and families, to get third-party independent opinions before they make decisions about drugs, before they go see different doctors, a whole host of things.
I mean, it's happening in Facebook, right? They're creating their own communities within themselves to be able to have those shared experiences and find other trusted folks before they then go, and take action on that information.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This idea of leaning in, obviously a lot of healthcare brands and pharma brands have sort of been hesitant to hop on TikTok or to sort of partner with influencers like healthcare influencers or healthcare creators. But we're seeing so many more HCPs hop on TikTok and develop followings and provide sort of that credible information. We also see a lot of patient influencers jumping out there and talking about their lupus diagnosis or their diabetes diagnosis. And a lot of creators on TikTok do skew female. So I'm curious, what you think are some of the benefits of brands kind of leaning in and sort of maybe partnering with female creators and what are some of the positives there?
I think there's a lot of positives because you have, with TikTok and with influencers, the reach is really tremendous. And I think it's a fine line in terms of being able to sort of have your brand message truly believed by, let's say, your key opinion leaders, by your patient advocates, and then you kind of have to let the reins go a little bit, to your point about like sponsored by so-and-so, sponsored by so-and-so, and trust the process for your influencers to then spread your message in their own way, in their own words, but still sort of getting to the North Star of where you're going. We have one opinion leader within the category we work in, and she has a tremendous following, but she's able to reach so many patients, right? She's not even just reaching her other physician counterparts, but she's educating patients in real time on TikTok.
And sort of coming back to this idea of bringing up the next generation of female health marketers, some of the things that Gen Z and the younger generations are very passionate about, gender equality, racial equity, LGBTQ plus rights, and that extends to their workplace. I'm curious what opportunities you see, even in your own organizations and companies, to amplify their voices and where their, passions can be put to use.
Well, so at ConcentricLife, we have employee resource groups. And they can be different diverse populations, they can be allied communities, they can be people of color. Just today actually, we dropped an AAPI cookbook. And I think the whole agency was kind of, so excited about it because we get all these recipes. And so, again, we're trying to ask people to be their authentic selves and how they show up to work. So sometimes it might be on the work that we are doing, but sometimes it's just show your true self, talk about your personal experience, bring it to work and have a community to talk about it with. Tell us what your holidays are and share them with us. So I've definitely seen a lot more of that in the past 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, at Spectrum, we actually just launched a new social campaign that's on Pride and on LGBTQ awareness and really getting out there with some of those messages. There's a few employees who feel very passionately about this, and they're out there sharing their stories. And again, they're being their authentic selves in the office, and then the company saying, we love this. How can we continue to tell your story and let you be out there and tell your story for more people to hear? It's just great to see the company taking a stance and being like, yeah, we're going to be out there. We're going to support this, particularly in an election year where there's a lot of issues at stake. And so it's something that they're getting behind, which is great to see.
So great to hear. So Jazz, we have ERTs, but what I really love where Jazz has taken it is that they really focus on the B in DEIB. So it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. If people talk about their culture, if people share about their heritage and feel like they are a part of a community, they also bring their best selves, they feel like they belong, they're gonna stay with the organization, they're gonna wanna grow within the organization. So it's a really important element, I feel like, of DEIB that is starting to take off as well too.
I think what we're seeing is for companies to be successful, they really have to kind of walk the walk. They have to believe it and own it and show it. Diversity is no longer a slide, PowerPoint slide with some different pictures. And the companies that truly embrace it, I think will do well. And those that still treat it just like, some headshots aren't going to be successful.
I think it's great that companies take a stance now, whereas before it was, oh, this is taboo, we can't talk about these things, and now it's, we have an opinion, and it's much better to have an opinion than to stay quiet about something. So I think I really appreciate how many opinions are being heard. You're starting to kind of group companies with what they stand for, and that's really nice to see.
The younger consumer is driving it, they're asking for it, they want to see what's behind that company, and I think companies are stepping up and providing
They want
it.
to see the actual personality behind a company,
Bring your
not
whole self
just
to
the
work
name.
day.
And I think you're exactly right that, that Gen Z or these new generations are pushing that. And we also know that they will align themselves with brands and companies that match their own values. And that's so important. So, and they're kind of pushing the status quo in terms of work, which I think is a benefit to everyone, not just these new generations coming in.
Slightly different example of this, but I know somebody who will not purchase something from any company until she knows that they're a sustainable company and does all of the research to really look into it, and will say, nope, I'm not buying that because it's not sustainable. And I think that we will see more and more of that, whether it's sustainability, whether it's something else that somebody's really passionate about, and making sure that that company even something as simple as a purchase of a shirt or a handbag or something like that, but we'll start to see that translate into a lot of different companies and types of goods.
Well, and it comes back to brands in terms of what is their brand purpose, right? Like, I think that's a question that we're seeing on a lot of brands, not just to sell a drug, but like, what do they stand for? What does this company stand for? What does it represent? Because people are more likely to engage with brands where they have a common or aligned purpose.
It also translates into, do I trust what they are marketing?
Yes.
So if I believe in their values, then I also believe that what they are going to market and what they're going to tell me in their messaging also aligns with my values, and that they're not lying to me and things like that.
I think there's a big paradox there when you think about values and public perception of sometimes big pharma. Right, because I think that people don't always see the good work that pharma does, the big pharma. They just think, oh, the price of insulin is expensive. They're not thinking, well, you're saving lives, and they're investing in research, and they're helping people in disenfranchised communities, or a lot of times people don't talk about all of those things. But again, that's where I think brand purpose comes to it, and we've got to do a good job of representing who we authentically are and the lives that we're trying to save.
Do you feel like that's changing? I feel like, based on where the pharmaceutical healthcare industry was 20 years ago and where we are now, like, we still have a ways to go, but I feel like we're starting to have a mission, be able to communicate that mission, so that when people do look, when consumers, stakeholders, governments come to look at us, they see that we are trying to do good, and we have a ways to go, but I feel like we're starting to move the needle in the right direction.
I feel like we're moving the needle, but there's still a lot of misperception. And so, and it's so much easier on our side of the table to be able to say that, right? Because people don't see the things that happen behind the scenes, or, pharma doesn't always brag about the good stuff that they're doing. And so I think it's changing, but I would like to see it continue moving that direction.
What would you say do you think needs to be put in place to kind of help move that forward?
To accelerate that growth?
Yeah.
I would say more transparency.
Well, I also just think being more vocal. I don't think we talk about the things that we do because we feel like it's sort of touting our own horn, but I mean, there is so much good that the range from small biotechs to really large, pharma footprints are doing for communities locally, statewide, regionally, different groups, different ethnic groups, that I just think we need to be more transparent as an industry of what we're doing. And I also think we need to just partner better together so that we can sort of combat that misperception, because we can do it a whole lot better if we do it together.
I agree. Absolutely.
Creating that emotional connection is so important, and I think we're seeing things change and go in the right direction, but there can be so much more.
And looking towards the future, I'm glad that you've all sort of brought up some of these anecdotal experiences of there being some progress that you've seen in recent years. But also, as we've discussed, there's still a long ways to go when it comes to moving the needle on female representation in healthcare. Are there any emerging trends or sort of movements in the coming years that you're particularly excited about that you think is going to start moving the needle, or that you're kind of hoping to see?
I know with research, at least for my company, research takes several years to happen, as we all know. It doesn't happen overnight and it's published the next day. So just getting those clinical trials started, getting those people in place, and moving that through the process, it will get us there, but it's going to take some time.
I mean, to go back to where we started the conversation, I'm excited to see where we're going to go with women's health. I mean, there's been so much of this groundswell of a movement of conversation and just more conversation on social media about things like endometriosis and menopause, and the pharma industry is catching up with that, and we're starting to see more clinical trials in that. So I'm excited to see what therapies are going to come from that. We're not there yet, but we're starting to get to the point where maybe in the next 5 to 10 years there will be more therapies that were designed for women, tested in women, and approved for women and for just women's issues.
I agree. I think those conversations happening are the first step, and then we're going to see the result of those in the years to come.
I don't know if you guys saw Maria Shriver's speech at the Oval Office. I think it was in March, $12 billion executive order that still has to be passed by Congress. But the movement is there to really start and invest in the research and the funding. So if that goes through, I mean, that will be a game changer for future years.
I'm excited to see how the workplace changes as we see more and more women become leaders. I think there's research out there that says that the typical 9-to-5 workday was based on a man's ability to kind of work those hours, doesn't take into account, a woman's cycle or the number of hours of sleep that they need, or the fact that sometimes we have to leave and go do other things and then come back to the office. So I think as we see more women leaders taking over, some of our workplace dynamics will change as well.
Yeah. I think also as celebrity audiences are aging, we're seeing some of these women's health topics come up more, right? Where women are using their voices to say, here's my experience and I want to demystify this, and I don't want it to be a stigma anymore. So I hope that those conversations keep going and can trickle down to some of the younger women as well, because I do think that there's an opportunity for broad influence there at a larger scale.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great way to wrap up. We are just about at time. So thank you all again so much for joining the MM+M Women of Distinction Roundtable 2024. Thank you again.
Thank you for having us.